And I found out, much to my chagrin, the woman was having a dinner party in the room next door, and I was yelling at her and her husband. An early sign that I was not afraid to take on some neuralgic issues, maybe. I was not a kid with a winning personality. I wanted answers. Why did God make us? Why is there so much suffering and sadness in the world? Why do we hope anyway? How can life make you want to cry so often? Sometimes because it's awful, and sometimes because it is so beautiful. So, as a teenager, I started visiting a few convents, including a contemplative convent in Philadelphia, wondering if that's where God was calling me. Is that what he wanted me to do? I was just so interested in the faith. You can imagine just seeing me right here, right now, being a bit of a talker. Both of my fathers in heaven, my biological and my celestial father, are still laughing over that one. Then one summer I went out to West Virginia thinking, well, maybe I can help the poor as a social worker, so let me go find out what that is. So I go out with an order of priests, the Passionists, who have a mission out there, and I work in the prisons with the prisoners' kids. And I go out into the mountains and I'm putting roofs on some of the little shacks out there. Feeling called to that work. I was glad I did it. But when I got home, my mother had been telling everyone in the neighborhood what a saint I was, and it came to the attention of the local paper, and the local paper did a story. And then I got called, some of you may remember a guy on the radio named Norman Vincent Peale. And he did this show about the power of positive thinking. And the next thing I know, Norman Vincent Peale is calling me and wanting me to get on and talk about this kind of Catholic missionary work. So I think I was 17 or 18. So another little indication that sort of God was calling me to speak about the beauty of faith to the world, very early on. At that point, I thought, what next? I was studying voice, opera training, but my voice coach kept telling me that the best I could hope for was to be chasing tiny operas around Europe, getting really little parts till I died. I was okay, I looked great. And she said, you know, I can really see you in law school. So off to law school I went. And then, of course, you rack up these giant loans. I went to Cornell, it was expensive. I joined a firm, though, representing the Philadelphia Archdiocese and lots of other religious entities in Philadelphia. And I thought, okay, I found my spot. I have found a place where I'm doing something good in the world and something good for the church. It wasn't enough. Mostly I was doing civil litigation, even though it was on behalf of the church. I thought I had something different to give. So I heard about an opening at the National Bishops' Conference in Washington, D.C. And I went down there and at the same time enrolled in the master's and then the doctoral program at Catholic University in systematic theology. My husband, we were married but living in separate states, so I had all this time on my hands. Catholic U told me what to read for theology, so that was what I did with my spare time. Among other work at that time, I got to work on the U.S. Bishop's briefs to the Supreme Court on euthanasia, capital punishment, religious freedom, abortion, etc. Again, I thought, okay, God, done, cooked. I'm in your service, this is great, this is what I want to do. Not so fast. One day, the General Counsel got sick, and I was asked to fill in at a meeting for him. And it was at about that time that the U.S. bishops were looking for sort of a public communication space. And I had been approached about it a couple of times, but I really wanted to be an academic. And I had said to God again and again, I want to do scholarship, I want to be a professor. Communications is beneath me. I don't want to do that. Please don't ask me to do that. So I kept getting asked to do this, and I go to this meeting, and at the end of the meeting that I've given this presentation in lieu of the General Counsel, I get people responding, you got to do communications in the church. Why aren't you in the communications office? You know, that's really where you're called. I continued to say no for about another 9 months, trying mightily to finish my PhD, at which point I had what I can only report is my only smells and bells experience. You know that expression, where you actually feel that God is kind of taking you by the shoulders and directing you pretty particularly. I only had it once, just so you think I'm not a little loopy. I only had one of these. I was at church at a parish called St. Stephen Martyr in Washington, D.C. And And when I got up to leave after Mass, all I can say is that I was given to understand that I should get back down on my knees and shut up and listen for a change. And what I heard was that I should take the communications job, and too bad if I thought it was beneath me. So I went in and I took it, and I did not finish my PhD dissertation. In the next 10 years, my job was explaining complicated things in politics, law, theology, a mix of all of them, on nearly every news and talk show in the United States. Sometimes I would be before 25,000 people in a stadium. Sometimes I would be in front of 4 people in a high school gym. Sometimes I was in front of the Democratic committee. Sometimes I was in front of the Republican committee. I was prepared for none of it. I had a half hour of media training. But honest to God, God always brought more out of the talk than I could consciously put in. And I began to think maybe he had a point. And maybe this is where I was being called. It was a high wire act. Because of Catholic social teaching, half the time the Republicans didn't trust me in Washington, half the time the Democrats didn't trust me. I was trying to explain the consistency of the Church's stance on behalf of human life at every stage, and being sometimes appreciated, sometimes resented. So I've been doing that and teaching full-time in law school for about the past 20 years. So from this story that I just told you, just one little person's story, perhaps we can pick out the kinds of ways, again, even in the life of one little person, that God calls. And this is in addition to that smells and bells thing, because I'm just not sure that's ever going to happen again. I think that's a one-off. The first way that I think God regularly calls is through beauty. The beauty of the examples of the Catholics that you've come to know. The people who, when you talk to them, you think, I want to see life like that. I feel better when I talk to you. I feel like things are possible. I feel like I can come a little closer to God. I feel like I could be happy too if I lived the beautiful, virtuous life that you live. The people who were as patient and as realistic as the social workers and the prison counselors that I worked with in the Marshall County Maximum Security Prison in West Virginia. The people who were as smart and who donated completely to the service of the Church. You may have heard that wonderful essay by the French philosopher Etienne Jusson, Intelligence in the Service of Christ. These nuns were a walking, talking exemplar of that, brilliant and completely humble. People who were as happy as the children on the cover of the textbooks, who knew Christ and who knew that Christ knew them and loved them too. I wasn't just attracted to that beauty when I was growing up, but as I traveled for the Church in the United States during those 10 years that I was in communications for them, I saw so much beauty. I always came home with more energy than I left. My father, I will tell you, my realist father, was very afraid that when I went in to work in the Church inside the structure, that I would lose my faith. Much like seeing a sausage factory and never wanting to eat sausage again, right? He was really scared, but I actually found the opposite. I would go to a diocese in the West, for instance, and meet a pro-life director who told me the following story. She went to her husband, who was in the basement, building this kind of man cave because their last child was leaving for college. And she says to him, I know why our youngest child is not behaving like herself. She's pregnant. And in a beat, the husband turns, and with his tools, he starts smashing at the walls he's just put up. And she's trying to calm him. Honey, it'll be okay. It's okay. We're going to see it through this. What are you doing? And he says, I'm building a fill-in-the-blank nursery. That's what I'm doing. And he did. And they took care of that baby while the daughter went to college but came home every weekend and took up that cause. I met those people. I met the people who founded a crisis pregnancy center in the Midwest, who then discovered that when the women had the children and were beginning life on their own, most of them had no way to furnish an apartment. And they set up a warehouse of the coolest everything you could need to set up your own home down to the last teaspoon. I met a historian in France who helped Catholic Charities there set up a hospitality center, a coffee house hospitality center, so that the homeless would have a dignified place to come and share a cup of coffee with each other. I would be in Rome at a conference and meet a delegation from Africa. And before I could put my hand out and say, I'm sorry about whatever it was, the latest Ebola or famine or something that had happened in their country, she would put her hand in mine and say how sorry she was for the spiritual poverty in the United States and express her sympathy to me first. It's breathtaking and faith-affirming to see up close the impact of Jesus Christ in every country in the world. It's humbling to see the faith lived elsewhere, more purely, more sweetly, more fervently sometimes. It's exciting to observe that not only historically, but today, some of the smartest people I have ever met on the globe are turning it all over for the faith. The church has its problems, I know, but many of its people are heartbreakingly beautiful. They enable us to know God the only way human beings come to know stuff for the most part, which is through other human beings, through attraction to humans who reveal, through themselves, God's passionate commitment to the individual, who do what Pope Benedict put so gorgeously in Deus Caritas Est, that encyclical God is Love, to give every person that look of love they crave. So beauty, I think, is a way that you should really pay attention to in thinking about how God is directing your vocation. A second way I think that God speaks to you is through just the needs that are around you. A vocation isn't just about what you feel called to do. Everyone here who's ever applied to college or helped their kids apply to college is so sick of being asked for their kids to write an essay that says, what's your passion? Most 17-year-olds are like, I don't have one yet. A vocation is not just what you feel strongly about. A vocation is also the needs around you that you are built to fill. And sometimes you find that the place that you're serving and doing beautifully is not the place that you anticipated. Not at all. But it's rather the place that needed you the most. Third, a next place that you can look to see where God is calling you is this basket of talents that God has given you. God can take your weird basket of talents and put them to use. It turns out that God could work with a voice-trained lawyer, amateur theologian, with my people skills honed at a diner in Philly and on the assembly line of a welding factory, right? Where I had to learn to get along with the frat boys at night, the welders in the day, the truckers, the business owners. God made use of those experiences in my life. Listen to the people who love you. Listen to the people who've taught you, and others who come to know your gifts. They are part of the voice of God, who, making you in his image, has also given you a share of his gifts. And it will help you figure out how to serve. It doesn't have to be in the church structure. It doesn't even have to be with explicitly theological or spiritual conversation that you have with someone else. When I was very publicly visible during TV Weekly and tripping off to Rome and other countries and getting, you go to both parties' political conventions, I would get boatloads of calls from unhappy young female lawyers slaving away at law firms in Washington and New York. And they would say, I want to be inside the church. I want to just be promoting things that the church says so I can be safe that I'm saying the right and true things. But I would have to say to them, there is service wherever you are. Fathers and mothers are doing it at their home, open-endedly loving and serving their children every day. So is the bank teller, the secretary, the doctor, as they render honest, cheerful service to every human being who proves to be their neighbor, to the point where everyone begins to wonder, what is the source of that peace and joy and happiness? And they want to know. And then you can have the conversation about Christ. A caveat here regarding discerning your needs and exercising your gifts. This seems very nuts and bolts for a Eucharistic Congress, but I think it's important. Win the freedom to do what God's calling you to do by never living up to your income. Never put golden handcuffs on yourself. Always be willing to leave the money for what you're really being called to. I know I didn't do that at the beginning of my career, and I felt very handcuffed to my large law firm. But once I decided that, well, I would pay those loans off somehow, and made the leap, God took care of things, right? It wasn't easy. I was still paying them off 10 years later. I did it. But after that, I made sure I never spent what I made so that I could go where God called me. Let me conclude with a few remarks here. Sometimes you learn a lot more about a thing by by distinction than by description, okay? This, I think, is true of our faith. I think it's true especially as applied to the fact that instead of having some distant, fearsome, all-powerful, but completely unapproachable, and maybe even disengaged God, as some religions propose, we have a God who possibly, truly, he can do it. It's within the realm of the possible, even though we can't see how. Loves each of us as individuals. It was in his gaze upon each apostle. It was in his gaze upon Mary Magdalene, upon the thief beside him on the cross, upon the widow who had lost her only son and would really be lost in society after that. I could go on. I know this is really hard for us to believe. You know, we think of people, maybe generally human beings, as too egotistical. And perhaps many people think of Americans as more egotistical than anyone. But actually, in our deepest selves, we really wonder if God could really have done what he did for us. Every Lent, I watch that movie, The Passion, again, to remind myself and any one of my kids who can take the suffering in that movie of the literal pouring out of flesh and blood, which gives the Eucharist a whole new meaning. But every Lent, I have to meditate freshly upon the fact that God could have done that for me. We really can't imagine it, but he means us to understand it that way. And there's more. Not only does he love you individually, but he's actually going to the trouble in the mundane workings out of your life, in the people that you are related to, in the people who are in your community, your neighborhood, the people you encounter, in those mundane workings out of your life. He is calling you according to your gifts and according to the needs of your nearest neighbor. And sometimes beyond that. There's this beautiful Spanish phrase, cada persona es un mundo. Every person is a world. And I think of all the trouble that God has gone to into entering into my tiny little particular world in a corner of Pennsylvania, a little bit of Washington, to help me figure out what he wanted me to do. In the twists and turns of just my one little life. But he is likewise, and right now, putting people in your life to bring you to him through beauty, through attraction. He is laying needs right in front of you for you to wake up and see. He is showing you the fruits of your gifts. You look back on something you've accomplished and you think, I didn't know I could do that. I didn't know I had skills for that. People are praising me for something that wasn't really in my intention to make my vocation. But he is showing you through the fruits of those gifts, when you exercise them, how you are meant to serve him. And he's really just waiting for you to say yes and to do whatever he tells you. Thank you very much.